You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm Zarak Khan. With me is Eric Johnson. You can say hi, Eric.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
And we're really excited to have with us Spencer Greenberg. Spencer and I have met for the first time probably 3 times. But the first one was at the Behavioral Science and Policy Association conference in 2018 when Spencer was invited up on stage to talk about a company that he had founded through his startup Foundry that I found really interesting. And so I've been excited to kind of learn more about Spencer and his work and his background since then. So Spencer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So maybe we can kind of jump in and start with your background because it's really interesting, and I think it's a little bit kind of novel, a little bit different than some of the other folks that we've had on Action Design before.
Yeah, so I'm actually an applied mathematician by background. I did my PhD at NYU, and I specialized in machine learning. And I think that gives me a somewhat unusual perspective on behavioral science and on psychology because I come in with the mathematician's perspective. And so very often I'm asking questions about like the methodology and how do we measure things and what kind of methods do we use. And it kind of gives me sort of my own angle on things.
Yeah, I mean, so, because like measurement is kind of a key element of most behavioral science projects, right? Do you sort of think that, in your mind, are you sort of thinking of the measurement piece and then you kind of go to, what's like the behavioral angle here? And whereas you think maybe other folks are sort of more, hey, this is an interesting kind of, behavioral insight. How could I apply this? And then thinking about measuring it or...
Well, so as a machine learning person, I have a somewhat different perspective than the typical like stats person, and I think a lot of behavioral scientists are raised in kind of a stats tradition. And in statistics, you have hypothesis testing, right? You have a hypothesis, and you're trying to say is it true or not, right? But from a machine learning perspective, you're trying to make accurate predictions, and that's actually a very different world. So, for example, we're doing some research right now. We're trying to understand fatigue. We're trying to understand how fatigue and tiredness change throughout the day. And the way we're approaching it is we're building predictive models, and we're trying to capture as much R squared as possible to say, if we add more and more and more variables, how much of someone's tiredness can we explain, can we model, as opposed to saying, do we have a hypothesis about fatigue, and we're going to try to do some kind of test of its truth.
And how are you recruiting folks for that study?
Right. So we actually, to give a little background, so I founded a company called SparkWave. SparkWave is what's sometimes called a startup foundry or company builder. So what we do is we come up with new ideas for companies that we think will be socially beneficial. And specifically, we tend to focus in the social science space. And then if the idea is sufficiently promising, after we've internally built a prototype, we'll go recruit a CEO and ultimately with the goal of spinning them out as new companies. So we basically create new companies from scratch based on our own idea. But unlike incubators, we build the first version of the product in-house. We don't take outside teams with outside ideas. And okay, so to get to your question, from there, so we build these new companies. We tend to build them in 2 areas. One is applied social science. We're trying to take the best stuff we can find in academia that we think could really help people, that's not being used very much to help people, and try to apply it to help people's lives be better, or we're actually building technology to accelerate social science. And so on the first side, the applied social science, we have Uplift, which is our automated program for helping people with depression. And the goal there is try to be the best in the world self-help for depression. Or Mindease, which is a new app we have coming out that's designed, the goal is to be the best in the world for helping you calm down quickly whenever you need it, like if you're feeling really anxious or having a panic attack. So that's the applied social science side. On the other side, we build technology to accelerate social science. And so if you think about the process of doing social science and you kind of break it down, so you've got a hypothesis. Well, you have to build a study to actually test that hypothesis. You have to, that has to be in some form of code or some kind of system. Then you actually have to go out and recruit participants for it, and you've got to analyze the resulting data set. And we're actually building 3 different products that cover the whole range of parts of running studies. So for building studies and interventions, we have Guided Track. And Guided Track is the goal of it is to be the system that's the best in the world for building complex behavioral interventions and complex studies. Then for recruiting participants, we have a new platform we built called Positly. And there we want to make a really user-friendly system for getting researchers the people they want at the time they want and managing those study participants. And then finally, we have a newer product that's going to come out in a while called Hypothesize, which is for the statistics. And so that's on our side there. And so we run our studies using our own tools. So we build them in Guided Track, we build our interventions and studies in Guided Track, and then we recruit participants using our platform Positly.
Yeah, I think Guided Track was the first one that I kind of came across. I think it was in your presentation or your comments that you made at BSPA, and it definitely made I think there was a ripple of excitement through the crowd, which of course is all social scientists who are excited at the prospect of potentially accelerating their research.
I'm really excited about it because it allows you to build things that are much more complex than people usually build. So going beyond like a simple survey or having people read something or build a video, but building things that are more complex interactions, complex decision tree-based interventions, and also trying to reduce the separation between a study and a deployed intervention, right? Because people do all these awesome studies, and then, okay, I found this finding. Okay, but why not go release that to the world? Why not release that as an app, release that as something someone can use? And so we're trying to reduce that gap so that once you've run your study, you can then immediately turn around and just release that thing to the world as an actual usable intervention.
So, I love the model of the startup foundry as well. And I'm kind of curious, how you decided to do that versus sort of starting up and running one of these companies yourself. And then also, if you've ever been tempted to just run one of the companies that comes out of the foundry, as opposed to finding a CEO for it.
Yeah, well, I think, sometimes when people do create this kind of company, they end up just going with one of the companies they created. But really, my personal goal in life is to try to use technology to improve people's lives. And I feel like I'm best suited to do that by creating company after company after company, kind of putting many things out there and seeing what works best. Because I think my greatest skills are around idea generation, early stage product design, recruitment, rather than kind of the later stage sort of grow and scale the business. So I think that's really where I excel, and so that's really why I decided to focus on that area.
So I'd like to maybe go a little bit back into a little bit more kind of background. So I'm kind of curious. It's awesome you have kind of that math background. And I think, as you mentioned, that is unique, I think, in the behavioral science field where people tend to come more from statistics, where you come from more of applied mathematician, machine learning kind of that realm. So what I'm kind of curious about, and this is something I think as I've grown in the field and become more of a practitioner, I found, I originally got interested in it because I started reading these books about behavior and it was so interesting to me. But the deeper I've gone into it, the more I've realized how it's very technical and math focused, less than kind of the fun part. So I feel like I've kind of learned that later by doing. Fun. Yeah, I have, if I took math again, I'd probably love it. But unfortunately, 16-year-old Erik didn't have the same interest. But I'm kind of curious, what kind of came first? Were you really interested in behavior and just kind of social science in general, and kind of decided, realized that learning mathematics and statistics and things like that was kind of the route to do that kind of thing, to study that? Or did you kind of learn that sort of thing after diving into kind of really big data and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I've been really passionate about psychology for a long time. I think I actually first got into it really hardcore when I learned about cognitive behavioral therapy. And I started using it to kind of analyze my own mind, and started realizing that a lot of the claims of cognitive behavioral therapy are totally true of my mind, but I had never realized them. And kind of the behavioral spirals that cognitive behavioral therapy talks about, where, you're feeling bad, so you stay at home, that makes you feel worse, so, and creates these loops. And so that, I was like, wow, this is really insightful. This is really powerful. And I've personally, just the way I view my life is that that I need to devote a significant amount of my effort to try to make the world better. And that sort of like, to me, feels like a moral obligation I have. So basically, I kind of put those things together, and I'm like, okay, psychology, I think, has just this enormous potential to help people. And I'm a technical person, I'm a software person, I'm a mathematician. What can I do to leverage that, and started looking for opportunities there, and I started seeing them where I think that there are real opportunities where you can really help people doing novel things in sort of the realm of social science. There's just a lot of possibility that's not currently, there are a lot of people working on it, but there's still even more opportunity than there are people working on it. So that's why I started getting really excited, and as I started building the company SparkWave, I just realized that we could really largely focus on social science topics and have plenty of interesting stuff to do.
So as you've been kind of building this out, would you say that each company that sort of spun out of this has been sort of the kind of germinated from one idea, or is it like a series of studies where you're sort of building like a body of proof, and then you say at a certain point there's like a tipping point, now this is enough to sort of make it its own standalone company?
Yeah, usually each company idea it starts with a seed of an idea. And then there's sort of two processes we'll do. One is trying to actually build the first version, what we call V1. And for us, V1, that product should be the best in the world at the specific thing that we think is the thing that matters in that product. But the product might be weak in other areas. Like it might not be that pretty, it might have bugs, it might not have that many features. So, if you want to, but our kind of thesis is if you really want to test an idea, like if you put out the third best version of the thing in the world, like it's not really a tested idea. Of course people don't want to buy it, right? Because not only is it not the best, but also, it's an early stage product made by a company they've never heard of, and it doesn't have that many features and so on. So we want to create V1, which is the best version of that. The second process that we're using is we run tons of studies ourselves, just all the time, to answer kind of sub-questions and help us understand hypotheses around the product. So for example, when we were building Uplift, our depression program, we wanted to know, do depressed people know they're depressed? It's an interesting question. Do they identify with the word depressed? And so we ran a series of studies to help us figure that out. And we found out, yes, actually, the majority of depressed people actually identify with the word depressed, which I didn't necessarily think would be true. Or another example is we've been looking into, do people who have anxiety, are they able to come up with phrases that actually help themselves feel calmer? Or if you're trying to provide phrases that help them feel calmer, do you need to write them for them? And so that's another study we're running right now. So we do like tons of these kind of micro studies all the time to try to answer questions about the products.
And you said it earlier that you are recruiting folks for these studies like as you sort of release the product. Is that right? Or is it that you have like a kind of a group that you use like either through MTurk, or you've kind of built your own sort of separate MTurk? Isn't that right?
Yeah, so so Posily, you can check it out at Posily.com. It's our new recruitment platform. It's just launching. We've been actually using it for a couple of years internally, and we're just launching it to the public. And the idea is to try to make it faster, cheaper, easier to get your participants and manage them. And so we use that for 100% of our work. And that allows you actually through the system, you can recruit through MTurk, but the idea is we're actually building out different backends that let you recruit from different places. So kind of ultimately want to be a one-stop place where you can get exactly the people you need for your studies. We also, though, another thing I didn't mention is we run a website called clearthinking.org. And what clearthinking.org is about is taking results from academia that are not well known but are valuable to people's lives, turning them into interactive, fun tools and tests that people can use, and then to help them apply them to their lives. So we have almost 40,000 subscribers on Clear Thinking, and so we actually started running studies on our Clear Thinking audience, which is really amazing because it solves the generalizability problem, where how do you know if you study it on one group that's going to apply to another group? Well, for Clear Thinking, we run studies on our 40,000 subscribers, and then we build tools based on the studies that then literally get applied to the same people. So it's really elegant, and also obviously it saves a lot of cost that we can so we ran a study, we recruited 250 people from our audience for a month to do stuff, and that'd be very expensive to conduct.
Yeah, so that's all super interesting. And that was kind of a question as we were talking through, is you mentioned like doing research and studies, and like what kind of studies are those? So it sounds like you're going well beyond. I'm sure you do. I guess first part of the question is kind of thinking like, what are all the different types of studies you do? Is it sounds like the ones we're talking about here, it's like you're actively recruiting and selecting participants either to like actively use the products in a certain environment. But it also sounds like you're doing, maybe more like survey user research studies, like kind of qualitative stuff, like for the depression example that you gave. So like, what are all the like tools in the suite, and like, do you have sort of a process for determining through the life cycle of a product? Like, do you go through kind of an exploration of like, all right, let's do a survey and understand the problem more, then we'll move into prototyping, and then we'll do an A/B test later on or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny because you don't know this because we haven't talked about this, but I just recently gave a presentation on 12 types of studies that we run.
Perfect timing.
So we run all kinds of research. And the way I think about this, and the way I actually try to talk to our CEOs that we recruit about this, is you've got a tool belt. The tool belt has 20 tools on it. At any given moment, you have to decide what tool to use. Like each tool is a way of gathering information. Some of them might, one tool might be running a randomized control trial to test different interventions. One tool might be running a qualitative survey, right? One tool might be interviewing people. And so, you've got these 20 tools. At every given moment, you have to ask yourself, given the things I don't know, and the most important of those things that I need to know, which tool in the tool belt is best. And so we try to really not get wedded to any particular tool and really try to master all the various tools so we can use the right one for each job. We know when to use a hammer, we know to use a screwdriver. At least that's our goal, and really not be wedded at all. And I feel the same way about machine learning. As a machine learning researcher, a lot of people who do machine learning want to throw machine learning in everything, but that's just another tool in the toolkit, right? As so is statistics, right? Is another tool in the toolkit. So you got to know about that. So, but in terms of the types of studies we run, so just to run through a bunch of them quickly, like we run impression studies, like try to understand people's impression of a thing, which is a kind of qualitative research. We run studies to see if people understand an interface or if they get confused as they're going through it and what confuses them specifically. We run studies about visual awareness, like what do people notice when they go to a page? What's the first thing their eye catches? That kind of stuff. We run affect studies. We ran this fun study where we tried to actually, for clearthing.org, we tried to see how to boost people's mood as much as possible in a few minutes. We pitted a whole bunch of different interventions against each other, including like looking at cute animals. But it turns out that writing about a success you had and the impact that success had on you, like, crushes cute animals. So we released a little tool called our mood booster tool. When you need a pick me up, you can use it, and you can either get randomized to one of our effective techniques for boosting your mood, or you can pick which one you want. So that's another kind of study. We do predictive demographic studies where we actually try to predict which demographic will respond in a certain way. Well, with some outcome, and we'll look at like, does age affect that outcome? Does gender? Does other characteristics to say who will respond well to this product? So I could keep going to the list, but we do just tons of types of studies. But to get more specific, right now we have some really exciting studies going. We have one on habit formation where we're trying to figure out which small habit formation techniques get someone to stick to a habit. And so participants are randomized, so each person gets 5 out of 22 habit techniques picked at random. This is a kind of study design they used to use in farming a lot, where you have like each different little plot of land gets like a random amount of like, nitrogen and a random amount of water, and et cetera. And so we're doing it that way. Right? So you get 5 picked at random from the 22, and then we can use regression analysis to look at the causal lift of like, the people that got technique number 17, did that give them a boost in their habit formation? So that's a really specific example. Another example is we've been running a lot of research on how gender and personality are related for clearthing.org, because we're releasing a new tool to help people understand gender better. So those are just some examples.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Is it's kind of on topic of something I know, like I've been talking about, Zarak and I have talked a little bit about recently. Yeah. So I'm just interested to hear his input on this question as well. But one thing I've noticed, like, as I've gone in kind of being a more organizational application of like behavioral science, is that I think a lot of the what people think of behavioral science, which can take a lot of forms, but generally when people think of like kind of behavioral science in the field, they tend to focus really specifically on randomized control trials. Is like that's like the tool that you use as a behavioral scientist, And
I personally, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, so that's what I want to get to, because like I think I've sort of learned the hard way that like that is a big mistake, because I know in the current environment I've been working at, I became sort of the testing or the experiments person. Like we got people super excited about running experiments, but then you kind of run into realizing, it's actually really hard to have the proper environment to run a real RCT that gets you interesting results. Outside, unless you're something like Google or Facebook that has like almost an infinite sample size. Like and even then, you're still going to find the answers you want. So like, how'd you kind of, is that a problem that I guess you see? Because what I've seen is especially as a field, and generally also I think into digital products, like A/B testing has gotten so popular and so easy that it gets overused. When there's really so many ways to validate, answer questions, things like that. So I don't know if Zarak, you want to add anything to that, but then I'd be curious about your thoughts.
No, yeah. Spencer, feel free to jump in, and then I'll, because I don't want to get too far down into what Erik and I have been arguing about for the past 6 weeks.
I know that's a really fantastic question, and I totally agree. And so I'll go back to the way I think about this, which is you have something important that you need to know the answer to. Which tool in your tool belt is best to answer that? And if the answer is always randomized control trials or always A/B testing, then you're fooling yourself, because that's just not the way the world works. And sometimes we think of social scientists as like, okay, they magically come up with a hypothesis and then they run a randomized control trial to test it. And I would argue that if that's the way you operate, you're either a super genius or you're going to get tons of failed experiments where you don't get interesting results. Because basically in the real world, like, you often have to collect data to even get reasonable hypotheses. And one thing I think about, even when I run randomized control trials, is I think about baking the understanding of failure right into the randomized control trial. So, for example, we're running this study on sleep. We're trying to say, could we design a 20-minute sleep intervention that helps people sleep better? And the way that intervention works is it asks them a ton of questions about their sleep, tries to figure out the most promising sleep techniques, because there's like something like 15 or 20 different techniques you can do to try to improve sleep, and then recommends them based on their questions, and then tries to get them to commit to doing some of them. And so with that study, we said, okay, we don't know for sure this study, we think that this is going to work, but we don't know. So let's try to come up with every reason we think that this randomized control trial might fail to produce a result, and let's bake into the trial the questions we need to figure out which of those failure reasons actually is the failure cause, right? So that randomized control trial might just be the beginning of the research, because it might just totally fail, but at least it will tell us why it failed. But before we did this, you have to look at all kinds of other things. If you're designing an intervention, you want to understand, are people confused? Do they understand the intervention? Do they do it properly? And that takes a different type of study. When you're developing interventions, you might start really qualitative and try to understand the problem deeply by asking people about the problem they're experiencing. So there's just, really, if your goal is to solve problem X, you just got to think flexibly about all the ways you can get at that.
Yeah, and before Zarak answer, just to build on something you mentioned, is for me, that's kind of what I've learned, and I think the way you put it was you need data for good hypotheses, and I think that's what we sort of realized too, is that not only do you run into challenges of just having an appropriate environment to run a real RCT that will give you valid data, but also if you're not really doing all this upfront research, you're just sort of guessing in your hypotheses. So we've started thinking about using other forms of research to provide the B for the A/B test. So it's we need to fill in more of these gaps so that we have this educated guess that we can then measure with an RCT. So I'll let any thoughts you have on that, and then Zarak can give his opinions on the topic.
I couldn't agree more, because if you're running A/B tests all the time, what can tend to happen is you start running really trivial tests.
Yep.
Right, because you're like, well, let's try moving this button over here and let's try making it blue and so on. But how about running a qualitative study where you send 200 people to your website who've never seen it before and have them come back 20 seconds later and write everything that they noticed, and then go back and spend 3 minutes on your site, and then come back and write more about why they would or wouldn't sign up. And suddenly you spend 2 hours reading through that data, you're going to have a bunch of hypotheses about what to A/B test that you didn't have before. But if you haven't run that research, you're just kind of jumping all over the place making guesses, right?
Yeah, a long time ago, a researcher I used to work with said that big effect sizes in experiments come from user research. So, so Zarak, will let you jump in here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree with you guys on this, but I mean, I like the way that you frame it as a tool in your tool belt, because I think that the problem, and this is kind of the debate that Erik and I have been having for the past month or so, but I think that the problem is less with the tool or the mechanism and more with just maybe the culture of the organization, or it's really more a problem of the process, I think. So people love things to be easy, right? And so they love to have what should we do right now? let's run a A/B test, or let's do this, let's do that. You're like, oh, what should our hypothesis be? Like, well, let's just change it and see if it's better. Like, well, okay, that's not really like that's not really a hypothesis. Like, you don't have any kind of, you wouldn't know if it worked or not, right? So, or why, or the mechanism that makes it work, and that's what's actually interesting. So, part of the process kind of has to be this discovery phase, which can incorporate any of the other 21 tools that you have on the tool belt, right? To sort of say, what's actually driving this behavior or preventing this behavior. And then there's just going to also be environments where you can't necessarily run the like a randomized control trial or an A/B test, and there's other ways of kind of getting around that that we use, but I don't necessarily write it off totally out from the get-go, but
nor should you. I mean, it's an incredibly useful tool, right? But so are the others, and that's kind of how I think about it, is like you have to be a master of all the tools, because if you're not, you're going to end up using the ones that you're comfortable with, and then you're not going to be as good as you could be.
Yeah, and I think to some, it sounds like you have like a really, I'm not sure how big your team is, but like some of it's just a bigger, like we both work in big organizations trying to do this, so like that obviously adds complexities to research, and like people want stuff.
Absolutely.
But also it sounds like you just have a good system where like everybody knows those tools and gets in and out. There's like an educational process and like sort of a working to get comfortable with knowing when to do which thing, because to Zarak's point, people do want what's easy, and when I found like people want answers generally, and it's like if you start going on the speaking circuit talking about behavioral stuff, and if you really just like, we never really know the answers, all we have to do is like run our own research to find them, like that talk isn't going to be super popular. But if you go and say, I have found this unified theory of whatever, like everybody will pay attention and listen to and the same sort of thing happens in organizations where it's like people just want the answers. That is, as we've been starting to expand in more types of research, that is sort of like a fear I have, and that I'm trying to safeguard against, and that like, hey, here's a bunch of user research we did, here's this survey research, here's this data we found, and people have taken those and say, okay, we got the answer, we're just going to run with this, because like, no, we're not quite done yet there, but I can already see that it's like, that's just a natural kind of human tendency, especially if you're not as like, we're obviously kind of nerds about this stuff, so like we think about things in like decision making and that sort of thing. So maybe on that note, I mean, how did you refine this process of knowing all those tools? Obviously it sounds like just through your kind of education, you probably like learned a ton about this stuff, but has there been sort of a process for refining that toolbox and really having the sort of kind of clear frameworks or mental models for when to use which tool?
Right. So being a mathematician trying to go into the field of psychology, I have to be careful, and I have to say like, okay, I have to really understand this and not make the amateur mistake of thinking you know more than you do. So, I try to tread cautiously. Sometimes probably, don't tread cautiously enough. But one thing that we did is we sat down and we said, what are all the ways to try to develop hypotheses? Because if your goal is to figure out the truth about a thing, as opposed to, be able to publish a paper, or as opposed to be able to give a nice clean answer to other people, then you want to really say, okay, but what are the ways I can come up with hypotheses? And we did that, and we found there's a ton of ways to develop hypotheses. And some of them are really stupid sounding, and if you use the method, other people might think you're an idiot. But we use them because our goal is to figure out the truth. So for example, I use social media to develop hypotheses. I literally, before we run studies, sometimes we'll post on social media saying, anyone have any theory about how this thing works? Because we're about to run this study, and we want more theories we can test in the study. And sometimes I'll get 15 theories from people on social media, and then we'll just throw them all in our study. We'll make sure we use really large sample sizes so we don't trick ourselves with false positives. And then we'll test just scattershot, because, no matter how smart you think you are, like probably the hive mind is smarter than you are. So that's like a really stupid method of developing hypotheses. It's kind of embarrassing, but it works and we use it. And there's just so many methods to develop hypotheses. I mean, another is to go look at obscure papers that maybe people haven't seen, and look at what hypotheses people have developed that maybe just aren't well known, right? And, if your goal is not to be original, but your goal is to figure out the truth, again, it's not going to get you tons of kudos using someone else's theory, but it might actually be a great theory for what you're trying to do. So, just trying to be flexible and really understanding what your goal is. What are you trying to do?
Yeah, I'd say just before Zarak jumps in, I would just say that's super interesting too, because number one, I love that thought of like if you want to find the truth, then like you'll go take whatever route to get there. But also, it's interesting to look at other studies because maybe their study was underpowered or something. So like maybe they didn't quite prove. Maybe you have tools, resources at disposal for what you're doing that the researcher didn't. So it's worth revisiting that question.
Well, you should probably double check it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Just make sure it holds up. But that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to build technology for social science that's so good and so seamless that you can just develop a study and run it immediately. And, we've run complex studies where we came up with the idea at 6 p.m. and had it finished and analyzed by, 11 a.m. the next morning. And that's such a powerful thing to have, to be able to answer questions so fast.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, I was going actually in the same direction with this. I was having a conversation with someone night before last, and they were making the point that, a lot of folks tend to assume that there's like a huge body of research out there for like any situation and any kind of behavioral principle. It's like, oh, just go find the right answer. Like if you just do a lit review, you'll find it and come back and we'll use it and it'll work. And then when you actually go to sort of do the research, you find like, well, there's actually maybe not a lot of research on this thing, or the thing that we thought was going to work when we took a closer look at the study, like it was underpowered, or there was something, we have a question about the validity or whatever. How often when you are running these studies are you finding things that you sort of thought were going to work well that don't replicate?
Oh, we absolutely do. And the way I think about, if I find an individual academic paper claiming something's true, the way I think about that is it's a hypothesis that needs to be further validated, right? Because even if the research was really well done, and even if it's not a false positive, does it apply in our particular case? Very often, we don't have access to the materials they use, so if it's an intervention, we're rebuilding it from scratch. Ours might differ. Our length of our intervention might be different than theirs, or our population might be different. So it's a source of hypotheses, and there are many sources of hypotheses, and the different sources have different validities. So if that was like a really large sample size done in a demographic that was similar to the people we're going to apply it to, and the study design seemed really good, I'll be more confident that, whereas if it's a really low sample size on, a really random population or whatever, I'll be less confident. So, but again, that's just another way of getting hypotheses in my view. And this actually leads to an idea that I like to call a full stack social science, which is a metaphor based on the idea of full stack software engineering. So if you know that phrase, like a full stack software engineer works like on the back end and the front end of building an application, everything from like the databases all the way up to like, tweaking the user interface and making the buttons blue. And from my point of view, if you want to change the world with social science, you often kind of have to be full stack. You have to be everything from like coming up with or finding hypotheses, testing them, and all the way up to eventually deploying them in some way in the real world. Because if you just put an idea out there, chances are nobody else is going to take it and run with it. Or if you're only reliant on other people's hypotheses, you may not be able to answer the question you're actually trying to answer. And so, so I try to, encourage our teams to like be, dig into the whole stack. So one person might be working all the way up from hypotheses to designing studies to designing interventions.
Out of curiosity, how big is your team?
We're about 35 people. And
is that's including like the CEOs and the staff of the various startups that you've spun out?
Yeah, well, we're working on our first 3 spin-outs right now, actually. So in 2019, we hope to have three companies spin out.
Gotcha. Cool.
And how long have you been in operation for?
So we've been around for a couple of years.
Okay. Awesome. So did this all kind of spawn out? I know we talked a little bit about it at the beginning, but through kind of doing your PhD program, did you sort of like just learn how to a lot of these methods and just start building stuff, and it sort of became this, or did you kind of go in with the mission of building this kind of thing? Like, did it happen sort of organically, or was this sort of like the vision you kind of set out for?
Oh no, I mean the stuff you do in applied math PhD is very detached from
That's what I thought,
from this kind of real world stuff. And yeah, we would I never even learned anything about experimental design in my PhD. So I'm a collector of powerful tools, as probably is obvious from all the things I've said. To me, a probability theory is a powerful tool. Machine learning is a powerful tool. And so, what I was doing is I was trying to learn all of these powerful things, software engineering, and then eventually, like, psychological theory, experimental design started getting on my radar as powerful tools. And so this is just me bringing it all together. So it's sort of like me trying to live out my life's mission of like making the world suck less by applying technology and using all the tools that I've learned along the way. And so, the applied math, I use that a lot. I use that way of thinking. I actually use some of the mathematics itself and in our tools and so on, and some of the machine learning. But no, that's just like, that's to me just other things I can bring into the work.
What's next on your list of powerful tools that you want to add to the tool belt?
Well, I'm interested in causality stuff, like the backdoor theorem from causality research, which is, I think, not super well known. It basically stipulates, it gives you rules about when you can infer causality between things, which I think seems really important. And I'm sort of interested in investigating more to see if I can actually like make it practical, because I don't see a ton of papers using it, especially in psychology. In fact, I see almost no papers using those ideas. So I'm curious about it.
Huh, that's interesting. Is it something that, like, I've not heard of it before either? Or is it something that, the causal inference methods that are used in statistics are based off of this, or is it drawn from them and other things?
Yeah, so it's sort of like, the idea of a randomized control trial, like, why is randomization so important? Well, because it removes confounders on average so that you can infer causality, whereas if you don't randomize, you can't, right? But then you can think about, there's other techniques that allow you can infer causality. Randomization is not the only technique, right? You can use instrumental variables. You can use regression discontinuities. So then you could say, okay, but what's going on here? What's sort of the general theory of what's happening here? Why is it that these techniques let you infer causality and these don't? And then, so the backdoor theorem is sort of says, if you have a whole bunch of variables and you have some beliefs about the world, about like, well, I know, for example, that a variable in the future can't cause a variable in the past, right? Obviously, and then you have some other beliefs like, a variable A could cause variable B, but not variable C. And you kind of map this all out. The backdoor theorem says under which conditions you can actually say whether something causes something else. So it's sort of like the most general mathematical version of all of this stuff, like saying when can causality be inferred. And so, there's actually a Python package that came out. I think it's called do-why. That I'm interested in digging into that helps you apply these causal methods. So, it's cool stuff.
So
that is cool.
So this is actually a question I wrote down earlier. I think this is a nice segue into it. But how do you learn about these things and keep up with all these research methods? Because that's, kind of going back to what we mentioned of like, do you start with kind of the math statistics and then find out social science, or do you get into social science and go to that? I definitely got into the psychology first, and as I've learned how much more technical, much more savvy in the statistics and math and stuff I need to be, I've definitely found it really challenging to find good resources to like continually learn, stay up on stuff, and like actually like learn how to apply these things. So like, obviously, like you said, it sounds like you've learned a lot outside of your PhD and this kind of thing. So like, what have you found most helpful? Do you just read textbooks all the time, or like, are there other resources that you find make it easier to process, digest, implement this kind of stuff? Or, how do you learn it? Then how would you recommend somebody get started on learning all these methods?
And I would love if your answer is just, yes, read textbooks all the time.
and not sleep. Yeah.
I think reading textbooks is great, although I don't do it a lot. I do read a ton of papers in many different fields, from math to machine learning to psychology to, experimental design. And I think getting in the habit of reading tons of papers is really good. And also, when you don't understand the math, like stopping and being like, let me go read about the math, because I think, so let me give you a little tale about how I've been investigating factor analysis, right? And as a mathematician, we learn a kind of, the idea of principal component analysis is familiar as a mathematician, but the way that psychologists do factor analysis it's kind of different. And so I was reading about psychologists, how they do factor analysis, and I realized there are something like 15 different ways that people do factor analysis. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. There's so many different methods. Which ones should I use if I'm doing factor analysis? And I started digging into it. And when I kept finding these papers, they would talk about like best practices for factor analysis. But they would describe the methods at such like a vague level, or such a general level, that I was like, I don't really know what they're saying. And often they would cite other papers, and I go read those papers. They would also be describing the thing at a very vague level. To actually understand what's going on, I had to go way back in time to like way early papers, like from 30 or 50 years ago, and like actually just read what is the math? Like, what are they actually doing? How do all these techniques differ from each other? And it wasn't until I did that I feel like I finally beginning to understand like actually why there's so many techniques and how they differ. And it's sort of like, I feel like I could have endlessly read like the third-hand accounts of people interpreting people and never really understood it. And so I think that was like a big lesson for me of like, sometimes you actually you have to understand the math and you have to go back to the original sources to really get the thing.
Yeah, and then, so I guess just to close a loop a little bit, like where do you find all these papers? You just like follow researchers on Twitter, or do you have like really specific, or do you go on like Google Scholar to find the concept you're interested in, or do you have like common sources where you find new papers, old papers, stuff like that?
Yeah, well, Google Scholar I use a ton, and you can do commands like, quote, randomized control trial and blah, blah, blah. So that's really great. Another thing I do, which is going to sound stupid and maybe insane, is I use Facebook voraciously to find interesting work. And the way I do that is I'm just extremely aggressive about hiding posts I'm not interested in. So my attitude is like, my Facebook wall is sacred. If something's in it that I don't find interesting, I hide it. Or you can, if you really don't like what a particular person posts, you can unfollow them. But I tend to just hide individual posts, and I'm just training the algorithm. And now my Facebook feed is just a reliable. I learned so much about psychology, math, machine learning just from Facebook. So, and I think people have this attitude that like Facebook is this terrible and addictive thing, which it absolutely can be for a lot of people. But also, you're training the algorithm every time you do something. So, train it to be what you want it to be. And I really enjoy that.
I have found a very similar experience for Twitter for myself, and that like for a while it's like I just don't need to watch people debate about politics all day, and then like cleaned out my feed of like stuff like politics, and then like just followed a ton of like interesting entrepreneurs, interesting researchers, and now it's like honestly it's like addictive because I just learn so much every time I go on there. So I think like it is really easy to just get disenfranchised about those kind of tools because they're sort of like built. They make it easy to go to the more less important stuff or less interesting stuff, But like you said, you can kind of train the algorithm to surface the stuff there. You just got to spend a little bit of work to find it.
Exactly. And the rule of thumb I use is if I see something on Facebook and I'm like, am I better off that this is on Facebook? If not, I'm going to hide that, right? And and if you do that long enough, it really changes your experience.
This is kind of more of an observation, but like, and so I'm curious to see if you agree with me or not. But I feel like, based on we've kind of spoken, I don't know, 4 or 5 times now, and I feel like more than most people, you have like a knack for like categorizing and defining things like to a very specific level.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm glad you took it as a compliment. I made it.
No,
as a compliment.
to me, that is.
Yeah, there's a lot. We feel like a lot of times we're speaking like sort of generalities, and I was looking at some of the things that you've written, and just even from our conversation now, it's like, well, there's 22 tools for this. There's 8 types of disagreements. There's and it's like these are the ways that someone forms a hypothesis. Categorization of things where it's something that like. They all seem very useful and not things that I've necessarily given a lot of consideration to. It's just sort of like, oh yeah, this kind of happens.
Well, I think that what you're probably noticing is that like I have a certain approach to tackling problems where first of all, I want to understand like what are all the solutions I could have, right? Like, so that means I want to try to like systematically break them into groups, right? But like, what are all the ways to change human behavior? Let's make a list, right? Let's categorize them. Because to me, that's like a great starting point for going and tackling the problem. And then the second part of my approach I try to take is to try to get really specific about what I'm trying to do. Really, really specific. Like, okay, let's say I want to reduce the amount of people having the planning fallacy, where people tend to underestimate how long projects will take. Well, what am I actually trying to do? Is it that when people are going about their daily business and they're the moment they go to make an estimate about how long a project will take, they have this sudden thought, planning fallacy, and then they carry out a certain correction strategy, right? Is that like, that's getting really specific. And this is something I've noticed with entrepreneurship a lot, is that a lot of times entrepreneurs are not that specific about what they're actually trying to do. And this actually makes it hard for them to make decisions because they don't actually know exactly what problem they're trying to solve. And the more specific they can get, the more valuable it is. So I think that's just a mentality I have, is always try to say, what are all the ways I could do this thing so I can compare them against each other and know when to use which techniques, and then say, get really specific about what I'm trying to do so that I can then make decisions more easily.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like I already kind of know the answer to this because we're friends on Facebook. But are you, or in what ways do you apply that kind of thinking outside of work?
Well, I run self-experiments on myself constantly. I try to run 2 at a time. And so I think that's part of it, is like saying, okay, I'm not sleeping very well. What are all the different ways that people try to sleep better? And then, okay, which of them, 2 of them, are going to try right now? So also, I do a lot of writing, especially on Facebook, and I find that one way I can help provide value to other people is to try to take a topic that people feel like they already understand, and then try to systematically break it apart to give people a new perspective by being like, oh wait, wow, there's a lot more ways to do that thing than I realized. Like, I thought I knew how to do that thing, but I see there's actually other approaches that I had not been aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you've just built a lot of really consistent, like, decision-making frameworks and kind of mental models you can sort of apply to everything, that you can scale from your own personal decisions and things you're trying to test and learn and optimize, and, like, also scale a similar process to the business as well, and like how you guys decide to tackle problems, test it, ship it out, things like that. So, like, yeah, that was actually kind of when I was looking through your work earlier, I was just confused. I was interested to kind of hear this, is like, how do you approach, like, it sounds like you have a super systematic, I think we've kind of covered the steps to it in a lot of ways. It sounds like you have a super systematic framework for, like, decision making, all from, like, what's our hypothesis? Like, you have, like, systems for hypotheses, and just, like, you've really sort of, like, thought about that. And that's something, again, is like I've learned more in applying this stuff, is just like how difficult it is for people to think in, like, sort of a behavioral, because behavioral science comes down to, like, decision making in a lot of ways. And even as practitioners, we tend to think of, like, oh, like, yeah, like, to evaluate whether something works, you need to run an experiment, but then maybe you're not thinking, how am I biased and how I'm coming up with hypotheses? How am I biased in even deciding which problem to tackle? Things like that. So it sounds like you've done a really good job. So, like, what's been your process like to build out those frameworks to, like, really kind of, like, optimize and have frameworks for every level of the kind of, like, decision-making process?
Well, that's one of the things I really love about running SparkWave, is that because our product is companies, not a specific company, everything we do, we know we're going to have to do it again and again, right? If we're developing a logo, we're like, well, we're going to have to keep developing logos, so we better come up with a process, right? So this is the way I think about it, is like, whenever you have to do something many times, it benefits you to actually sit down, spend the time to build a process to do it, systematize it. If you just have to do it once, who cares? Just go, do it, hack your way through it. But if you have to do it 100 times, like, you better go develop a process, or you're going to be way, way, way better off. Okay, so then, that's why we have to generate ideas for products. So I studied the different ways people come up with product ideas, and it turns out I think there's approximately 5 different ways that people come up with ideas for their startups. I have a talk about it. We think about how do people solve difficult problems, and I'm like, well, I try to make a list of every way that people solve difficult problems, and so I have so if I'm stuck on a difficult problem, I can go to the list and say, okay, there's all these techniques here, which one applies to this particular situation, and so on. So, sort of like figuring out the thing you have to do over and over again, and then not just like, having to redo your work every time.
Yeah. Optimize everything, as it says.
That is literally the name of my blog.
There you go. On your blog.
Little plug there.
We're getting pretty close to the end of our time here. I don't know, Eric, do you have any final questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think building on, so, we kind of talked a little bit about how do you find new information and stuff like that. So I think, like, that's helpful for the continual learner. But, like, do you have any, like, resources that come to mind, whether it's books or particular papers that, like, given all the stuff we've talked about today, like decision-making frameworks, like running research studies, like, what would be some, like, really good starting points you would recommend for, like, a listener who, like, this all sounds super interesting and they want to, like, start diving in?
Well, there's this one amazing paper on survey design that's just so good that I just randomly stumbled on one day, and I'll give you guys the link later. But I've never heard anyone talk about this paper, so I think it's actually really great for anyone interested in designing surveys to read.
Do you have the name of the paper?
I'll have to look it up.
Okay, we'll show it in the show notes. It's actually interesting because I'm working on a survey right now, so I actually would like to listen to that or read that soon. Yeah,
totally. And if I may leave you all with a kind of controversial statement. So I've been thinking a lot about, like, how do you do science, right? And I've kind of come to think that there's sort of like 3 different approaches to doing it based on the incentive system that you have, right? So if your incentive is to like get a paper out, get a result out that looks nice, right? You're gonna have certain pressures on you that are gonna cause you to do things to try to like just get a nice, clean looking result. That, and often the world is not clean, and it's not always the greatest pressure. And in reaction, and this is partly why there's a lot of false positives, right? And in reaction to this is sort of the open science movement that says, no, to do research that's trustworthy, so that I can say to other people, no, my research is really valid, and they can believe me. You do research a different way. You do research by pre-registration, by open data so people can check your work. You state all of things you tested, you publish negative results, and so on. And so that's like I'd say a reaction to the first approach, which is instead of you're really trying to say to people, you can trust what I'm doing, right? And I'm going to do all of these things to show you that you can trust me. I would say that there's a third type of doing science, which is, wait for it, trying to actually figure out the truth. And when you're trying to actually figure out the truth, like imagine your child was going to die unless you figured out the truth about this scientific topic, right? You wouldn't care about getting publications, and you wouldn't care about proving to anyone else that your research is valid. You would just be dead focused on actually answering the question. And I think that trying to do that third type of thing is actually subtly different than both of the first two, and actually leads to somewhat different research practices than the first two, and I think in very interesting ways. So that's just what I want to leave everyone with as a kind of a thing to think about.
Yeah, just your target metric is so important and just shapes everything that you do. So like you have to be very intentional, thinking like, what's that specific outcome you're trying to do? Because everything's going to drive towards that. And if you pick the wrong one, you're going to get adverse incentives you don't think about, things like that. So
yeah, and incentives are just so powerful. If you have to get a paper out in 6 months to have a chance of getting tenure, that's going to be one set of incentives. If people are going to try to dissect your work and you're going to have to prove to them that it's valid, that's a different type. And if let's say your child's going to die unless you figure out the truth of this thing, that's a third type. And those are going to lead to different behaviors, interestingly different.
Yeah. That's awesome. Zarak, any last questions you have?
No, I was just going to say, you've got a bunch of interesting stuff going on, and folks are probably going to be eager to learn more about your work. So what are some great ways that they can either follow along or resources they should check out that you've got?
So if you're interested in seeing applied social science, check out clearthinking.org, and we have about 22 free tools you can try out, covering all kinds of things from happiness to bias and so on. If you're interested in building interventions or building complex studies, check out guidedtrack.com. We have our really powerful platform we built for that. And then if you recruit people for studies, check out positly.com, where we make it easy for you to recruit people for your studies. So,
awesome. Well, Spencer, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Action Design Radio.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.